Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today's video, I'm going to be making a custom river table for my grandparents from start to finish. So let's get right into it. Getting right into it, this is a piece of spalted maple that my grandma actually helped me pick out. As many of you may know, spalting is a fungus, so this piece had quite a lot of rot on it, as you'll see later in this video. Right here, I'm just setting the depth of my circular saw. I marked everything out prior to filming this, thought it'd be a bit easier. I'm just trying to get close to my lines, not perfect. I left a couple inches extra, like on any project, just so that I can trim it down after I do the resin pour. Like I said, this piece of spalted maple is very rotten. Thankfully, I was able to avoid most of it, not all of it. You'll see right in the next clip here, in the top left corner, where it's super pale, that's almost complete rot. I was able to dent my thumb in that with little to no pressure. Just goes to show how soft some spalted maple can be, depending on where it was when it was rotting. But yeah, pretty cool. Glad I was able to avoid most of the rot, but those cutoffs are kind of useless for me now. Now that I've got these pieces cut out, I'm moving on to preparing these slabs for their pour. I do feel a lot of people do skip over this step a bit, which is unfortunate. I make sure I get every single bit of dust off there. You can also see me removing some of the rotten bits as much as possible, so it's a bit easier later on in the project. Then I took my wire wheel, took it on all the live edge, and afterwards, I don't have the clip of it, but I used the air compressor to blow off all that loose dust that could have built up on there. Now that I got the pieces cleaned up, moving on over to my form. These forms right here are Exotherm Designed mold. This is a 2x4 foot one. The final dimensions of this table, though, are only going to be 20 by 22 inches. So I'm pretty much just utilizing the form as a base, and then I'm going to put walls within that to contain the epoxy. These are the sidewalls I was just talking about. They're basically maple plywood. They just have some tuck tape around them that'll prevent the epoxy from sticking to them. Then I just took some silicone, run a bead of that along those pieces, put them in, and then another bead of silicone on the outside of those pieces to make sure there's no leaks at all when I go to do my pour. A couple hours later, once the silicone was dry, I was ready to do the pour. So I calculated the amount of epoxy I needed. I did this by timesing the length, times the depth, times the average width, and then divide that by 61 to get the amount of liters I needed. In this case, it was around 4 or just under, so I mixed up right around 4. This specific epoxy is 3-to-1 by weight. I mixed that for around 5 to 10 minutes and then added my pigment in. So I actually did a pour with this specific color a couple weeks back, and my grandma really liked it, and that's the reason she chose this one. So I was a little worried I wasn't going to have enough pigment. This specific one is Blue Slate by Black Diamond Pigments. I used the rest of the bag because that's all I had, and it actually was just the perfect amount to leave it slightly translucent without being too overpowering. After I'm done mixing with the drill, I always make sure to use a stir stick to scrape the sides and bottom of my mixing container to make sure there's no unmixed epoxy. I did mix up slightly more epoxy than I needed, as you can see here. There's just a little bit of over pour, but I did decide after all of this that I was going to mix up some more because it's spalted maple and there's a lot of soft spots. I really wanted to coat all of the wood to allow that epoxy to soak in as much as possible. This specific epoxy takes 96 hours to cure, so I left it for around 100 hours or so, and then popped it out of the form and left it for a couple more days just to let it breathe underneath. I always do this because epoxy tends to have, I'd say, about 5% shrinkage as it's curing. I just wanted to make sure that it was completely solid before I went to machining everything. This piece, I did actually make it just wide enough that it could fit through my planer, just to make it a little bit easier on myself. I don't know where that clip went. I lost it somewhere. But the next step was obviously sanding. This is the longest task, and this being spalted maple took a very long time. Unfortunately, the epoxy pour didn't actually stabilize the piece as much as I wanted it to, so I went back around with Starbond adhesive, super thin CA glue, poured that in any soft spots, let that harden, and that actually stabilized this piece completely, which was great. After that, sanded with a few more grits up to 220, and then did a water pop, which basically raises the grains of the wood so that if you ever spilt like water on it or something, it wouldn't feel rough afterwards. So I actually do things a little bit differently than a lot of people I know. I usually install the threaded inserts for the legs right after I do my water pop. The reason I do this is because sometimes I might get a scratch or something in the piece while installing the legs, and this basically allows me to sand with my final grit after all this and eliminate any scratches that may have occurred. After marking out where the legs need to go, I drill the holes and install the thread inserts. These specific ones are by Rampatech. Absolutely love them. They're the only ones I've ever used and ever will use. Next up was sanding with my last grit, which was 320. There was actually a few soft spots still that I found on the top and the bottom, so even at 320 grit, I was able to use that super thin CA glue to stabilize those and just resand them down. Here I'm using Ruby Monaco Pure 2 Sea Oil. I've only recently started using this actually, and I'm absolutely loving it. I previously used Osmo, but I found its long-term durability wasn't as good. So here I'm just buffing it in as much as I can. I ended up actually mixing a bit more up afterwards just because, again, this is spalted maple, so it's a little bit softer and it was soaking up a lot more. After waiting about 15 minutes, I buffed everything off. I just use shop towels. These are cotton, they won't scratch anything, and they work great to pick up all of the excess finish. You basically want to wipe off and buff off any finish until your towel or rag, whatever you're using, is completely clean and no finish is coming off. Typically, you might see someone finish the top and the bottom at the same time, but personally, I don't like finishing the bottom and then buffing everything off and flipping my piece over onto my workbench or a shop blanket or anything like that, because I find dust particles get stuck to it. So instead, I finish the bottom, buff everything off, then put my legs on, which will allow me to just flip the whole thing over, and then it's ready for finish on the top. Not to mention, this method actually works really well for me. I've used it for quite a while now, and it allows for lots of airflow. Last but not least, I mixed up a little bit more Ruby Monaco to finish the top as well as all the sides. After buffing all that in for a few minutes, I waited around 10 to 15 minutes or so, buffed everything off, and it was time for the final reveal. Here's some glam shots I took right after buffing all the finish off. I absolutely love how this blue slate pigment contrasts with the spalted maple. After the finish is cured for a couple days, I brought it outside to take some final glam shots, and as you can see, the lighting really brought this piece to life. Absolutely love how it turned out. And there we have it, start to finish, custom river table. Hope you guys enjoyed. Please consider liking, subscribing, all that sort of stuff, and let me know in the comments what you thought about this table. It was a lot of fun to make, had a lot of challenges, but overall turned out awesome. I'll see you guys next time.